In this video, I'll take a look at the new auto-sampling capabilities being added as a free upgrade to Maschine Plus and the Maschine software, with quite a few tips and ideas on how to use them well. Auto-sampling, or multi-sampling, is a technique that lets you automatically sample multiple notes at multiple velocities of hardware synths, like this one, or software instruments like this one, and then put them into a compact, portable, and CPU-friendly format that you can use independently of the original hardware or software instrument. So for example, I sampled a preset of piano colors and then transferred that onto Maschine Plus, which can play it, including velocity sensitivities, independently of a computer. Same goes for the 700FS. I multi-sampled it using Maschine Plus, then transferred the sound file to my computer, and I can now play it over here. It won't be exactly like the original, but it can get pretty close. Now, obviously, neither option bottles up every little bit of character of the original hardware synth or the software synth, but there are some advantages. For example, this is a monophonic instrument, so you can't play chords with it, but you can play chords with a sample of a mono instrument. Multi-samples on both the hardware and the software can create standard wave files, so with a bit of packaging you can wrap them up to use them on non-native instruments like, for example, the Korg WaveState or Blackbox. When you use the Maschine software on your computer, you can also sample any plugin you like, even those not made by native instruments. The third reason you might find it useful to make multi-samples is to create CPU-friendly versions of instruments that run on your hardware. So for example, Monarch or Prism add about 10 to 20% of CPU usage to Maschine Plus, whereas multi-samples take up a relatively negligible percentage of the CPU here. Another important benefit of this new capability is that it does not require having a license to Kontakt, which can cost between $200 to $400 independently, depending on whether it's on sale or not. Just to get everyone up to speed on why multi-sampling is necessary as opposed to just a single sample, if you just take one sample and pitch it up a lot, it no longer sounds like the original instrument. So this may sound cool, but it doesn't sound like the piano that I was sampling. What you need to do is sample multiple pitches to get the right sound. Similarly, the character or timbre of a sound may change based on velocity. So ideally, a multi-sample will sample multiple velocities as well to capture that character. Now, some professional sound libraries may sample every semitone at multiple velocities. In order to get an approximation of the instrument, you could sample a bit less. So for example, when I auto-sampled piano colors, I did it with 4 velocity layers and samples every 6 semitones, which still generates quite a bit of samples, as you can see here. All this would be pretty tedious to create manually. Luckily, the auto-sample takes care of everything for us. Once you create an auto-sampled sound like this, you can save it as a sound either on Maschine Plus or on Maschine Mark III and share it or use it in your projects independent of the hardware or original software. Okay, so now that we know what multi-sampling is, why it's useful and why it's important, let's see how it's done both on the Maschine hardware and software. I'll walk through the process in parallel, sampling a hardware synth on Maschine Plus and a software synth using the Maschine software, but just to be clear, things can work the other way as well. So you can use the Maschine controller in software to sample hardware instruments, and you can use Maschine Plus to sample its internal software instruments, like I mentioned earlier, to save on CPU. I'll start up a brand new project here so you can see the process from scratch. Sampling hardware instruments does take an extra step because you can't hear it unless you route audio properly. In this case, it's a stereo instrument, so I've got 2 audio cables going out from the synth into the left and right inputs here. You also need to hook up a MIDI cable from Maschine Plus or Maschine Mark III to your instrument so that it can be controlled remotely. To preview that everything's hooked up properly, you can go into the inputs, choose the audio source, so we can now hear the synth, but like I mentioned, you also need to get MIDI set up properly so that you can control it. Channel 1 is fine, so I can now play this synth through Maschine Plus. The process is pretty much identical here if I was sampling a hardware instrument. When you sample a software instrument, all this is just taken care of automatically for us. The next step is to select the pad that you want to sample into. I'll just sample into this pad here and this pad here. Now, you don't have to rename your pads, but I recommend that you do so that you get proper file names, and when you save it, it has a proper name. Otherwise, samples will be allocated this really long and odd name. In Maschine Plus, just make sure you're in pad mode, hit Shift, and then rename, and then you can call this whatever you want. Let's just go for theremin, and I'll speed this up here. Okay, so now our samples will have proper names. Same here, only you'll want to rename the original sound, the plugin, because the samples will get its name. So just go into here and hit rename. Let's call this piano felt. And then the next step is to press sampling and make sure you enable the new feature called auto sampling in both. Now you'll see between 5 to 6 pages of parameters depending on whether you're sampling an external instrument or an internal instrument. By the way, if you prefer to use the software, all the parameters are laid out here on the bottom. The bare minimum before start is enabled is to go ahead and set up MIDI over here. And then if I go to Mark III, I need to either set up MIDI, but what I want to do is sample an internal instrument. So I set this to internal. And then on the input, just choose the instrument that I want to sample, which is this guy here. So I could theoretically hit start and be done with, but that really wouldn't generate a multi-sample. Let's take a look at a few of the details of the parameters that you can change here. So the first duo is note on. That's how long in seconds or milliseconds that you want the note to be held. So say, for example, perhaps 3 seconds is enough because we'll talk about looping in a bit. And then you need to add on top of that the total sample time, which is how long it takes the sound to decay after you release the note. So that's that little spring reverb there. Let's maybe go for 4 seconds here and maybe 6 seconds total sample time. For the piano, I'll just let it decay a little bit longer and leave it at 2 seconds, or maybe go for 3. Let's do that. We already talked about the next page, so let's skip on to the note map page. By default, it's set to 1 note, which obviously makes no sense because we want to sample multiple notes. You need to know the range of your instrument in order to set this, the range in which it sounds good. So for example, if I go back to play the 700S, its note range is from C1 to C5. If I play a lower note into it, say C0, it still plays C1. So there's no point in sampling below C1. And same goes, I check this, it only goes up to C5. Any note above that doesn't play a different note. So if I go back into this pad and sampling, I really want to sample from C1 all the way to C5. And then stride lets you determine how many notes you want to sample within this range. A stride of 1 means every single semitone. I think every 6 semitones gives a good representation of an instrument and doesn't take up too much space. And that's pretty much what you need to do for note map. The next page is velocity map. Now, the 700FS is actually not velocity sensitive, so it's okay if we just sample 1 velocity. Let's check out piano colors. Here we also want to set a range. I checked this before. I certainly want at least from C0 to, let's say, C7. And let's go for stride of 6 here. However, for a piano, obviously velocity is important. A way to check how sensitive your piano library or instrument library is to samples is to go into 16 velocity mode. This plays the different velocities of the instrument regardless of how hard you press, so you can get a feel of where the timbre changes. What I did is just went for a low velocity of 25 and a high velocity of 100. You definitely want to change the stride here because you don't want to sample every single velocity in that range. If I set it to 25, it's going to sample at a velocity of 25, 50, 75, and 100. You want to make sure extend is set to on, both for note mapping and for velocity mapping, because we're not sampling every single note. We want to extend the note's range to adjacent pitches and velocities. Let's move on to the next page. There are 3 batch processes that you can choose to apply to each sample after it's sampled. The first is find loop. This will try to automatically auto-detect loop points within the sample. It makes sense for samples that sustain potentially endlessly. It makes less sense for samples that just decay like pianos, and it doesn't work as well. The automatic algorithm doesn't work as well for samples that constantly decay. It's sort of looking for an attack, decay, sustain, release type sample. So we'll leave that at off for the piano sample. Trim silence will trim the beginning and end of the sample. In this version of the firmware, you can't set a threshold for silence, so it'll only work at complete silence. So trim silence is relevant mainly for software plugins, less so for hardware instruments that might transmit a bit of noise, or the interface might have a bit of noise in it. It would be nice, by the way, if they added threshold detection to trim the samples, because if you sample an external instrument, the more latency you have in your system, the longer the time you'll see the little gap at the beginning of the sample. With Maschine Plus, it isn't that bad, but if you're sampling using an audio interface, that's going to depend on your buffer. I would recommend going into the settings and setting the buffer to as low as possible if you're sampling a hardware instrument using Maschine Mark III and the built-in audio interface, or an audio interface in your computer, so that you just might get away without having to trim samples manually. I'll show you how to do that later on. Anyway, the last batch process is normalize, meaning lifting the volume of the sample if there's some headroom. You can do that if you're sampling an instrument like this, which just has one velocity level, and levels don't vary as you play higher and lower notes. However, since normalization is done on a per sample basis, as opposed to the entire auto sample, you don't want to enable normalization for instruments that are velocity sensitive, because that would defeat the purpose of having velocity sensitive instruments. So that's the last page for software instruments, and here you can turn monitoring on. That's pretty much it. To start the process, just hit start, and it will start taking samples of the individual notes. You can sort of estimate the total time this will take by taking the total sample time, processing time, and the number of samples that it's going through. I'll speed this up. Once it's done, you can take a look at the different samples in this instrument, review the loop points. So let's take a listen to these. Let's, for example, take a listen to the loop points, the automatic loop detection. Not bad. If I wanted to, I could edit this. See if there was a click, which there may be a bit here. You could add a crossfade, and you can preview the different samples. Sounds okay, but again, a little crossfade probably won't hurt. And then, like I said, latency here isn't too bad, but if you really wanted to, you could go ahead and try and trim the silence at the start point, either by editing the sample or just by shifting the play range a bit. Now, there are a few more things that you can do to edit this, but let's give piano colors a shot here. You can see this process is going to take considerably longer, even though we set stride to every 6 semitones, because we've got 4 velocity levels. We're sampling 60 samples, so I'll speed this up as well. And once it's done, we've got all of our samples neatly organized with 0 tedious manual labor. One thing that would have been nice if they added, hopefully in a future firmware version, is the ability to edit more than one zone at a time. So rather than having to go through these manually and say, adjust the start point a few milliseconds forward, or perhaps rather than manually increasing the crossfade, which is though pretty easy if you have quite a few samples, but it would be nice if you could edit multiple zones at the same time. So theoretically, we're done with our multi-sampling, but not quite, because the sampler plugin within Maschine has quite a few parameters that it might make sense to edit. Not to mention if we wanted to add any more effects in the chain before we save the sound. So within the context of this sample, for example, you can hear that this sound has this sort of reverberant decay, and here it ends rather silently. That's because the reverb is in the tail end of the sample, and currently, if you activate looping, it's gonna stay in this loop. Let's maybe add some crossfade here as well. So this won't be a full sampler plugin tutorial, but there are quite a few parameters that we can change here. For example, we could force this to be a monophonic instrument if we wanted. Let's not do that. And let's take a look at maybe a few other parameters here. If release is too short, we can add a release to this. If we want a bit of the reverb back, obviously we can always add reverb to this or any other effects. So not quite a spring, but we get a bit of that back. And then back into the sampler plugin. Again, there's multiple things we could change here. Envelopes and an LFO that can be sent to pitch, cutoff, drive, and pan. Same goes obviously for the Maschine software. All of these parameters are available. Once we're done, we can save the sound as an independent entity for use in other projects or the Maschine software. You go to Save As and then just choose the sound, make sure it's with samples, and then simply hit Save As. I've created a bunch of these, like I mentioned, see below. And then on the software, you just do this with a mouse and keyboard, the good old-fashioned way. Save with samples, rename, and save. The end result is this MXSND file, and then a folder with all the different multi-sample files in it. So that's pretty much it for the auto sampling feature of Maschine Mark III, the software, and Maschine Plus. Grab your free 700 FS multi-samples below, with even more on my Patreon, along with my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.